Hi, everyone. This is Arthi from Human Chapters. I'll tell you a bit about Human Chapters. Humans are living narratives with a past, present, and future. These narratives constitute of a number of chapters across a lifespan. The aim of these conversations is to highlight a chapter of the narrative and unpack its connections to other chapters. I don't care whether people are natural storytellers, but I truly do believe each one of us has a worthy story to share. An acknowledgement to country. We acknowledge the traditional owners of the land which now comprises Greater Shepparton. We pay respect to their tribal elders, past and present and emerging. We celebrate the continuing culture and we acknowledge the memory of their ancestors. And today we are talking to Quintin. Quintin comes to us from Atlanta, and Quintin's chapter is The Start of It All. Go for it, Quintin. Introduce yourself.
Yes, indeed. Well, thanks again for having me. I'm so excited to be here. So my name is Quintin Bostic, and Quintin works. That's my name.
Yeah.
Like you said, I'm from Atlanta, Georgia. Been living here in Georgia for my entire life. And my world is early childhood education. It has always been early childhood education, but that wasn't always the direction I wanted to go. But I just have a love for children, a love for books. I am fully committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion and anti-racism as far as how it impacts the lives of children, adults, but especially the way that the minority children, especially Black and brown children, see themselves in literature. So yeah, like I'm fun. I like to have fun. I'm a former teacher, especially pre-K. So I get down, get busy, have a good time. So
I love it. That's brilliant. Yeah, kids are absolutely wonderful, and just their energy, is a real gift. Yeah.
It can take a lot to keep up with some pre-K and preschool children.
Yes, indeed. Oh my goodness. So tell us, Quintin, where did all of this begin? Your chapter is titled The Start of It All. Where did it start?
Yes, so it's a very interesting story. So I grew up in a very small town here in Georgia called Augusta, Georgia. And I had dreams of like going into the STEM field. I mean, my father works in STEM, my mother works in STEM. So it was just something that was always just a part of my life and who I was. And so applying for colleges, of course, I had this strong STEM focus. I'm like, I want to go to these schools that have great access and resources and programs that can really help me to be, at that point, I wanted to be an anesthesiologist. That was the goal.
Yeah.
And so I remember applying to Georgia State and getting in, visiting the school, and it was everything that I wanted to be. It was a diverse campus. It was innovative. It was in the middle of the city. It had so many people. So I decided to go there. When I got there, my first major was biology. I said I want to be an anesthesiologist. And I just remember going into those 8:00 in the morning classes, like bio at 8 in the morning and chemistry at 8 in the morning. I was like, I don't know if this is the life I want. I was like, everything's really, really hard. But of course, I'm like, I'm a freshman. So I'm thinking, hey, it's just transitions, right? Yeah. And so at the same time, you know, I needed to work a job. I needed to support myself, make sure I had food on the table.
Yeah.
And so I started working at a child development center that was on the campus of Georgia State. And so when I first got there, I had no experience at all working with kids at all and had no intention on ever working with kids, to be honest with you. But it was just a job that it paid and it helped to feed me at night. And so I remember specifically one day, like sitting in the classroom, and it was a little challenging at first, having no experience working with young children and just navigating the everyday life of a teacher in the classroom. So I had a lot of struggles, but what I will say is that one thing about the classroom that I love to death, and it was my tool for communication, were books. Yeah. And I would be able to pick up any book and read it to kids and talk to them about the books, talk about the pictures, talk about the words and what the words mean and how the kids could use the words. And so to me, it was in that moment, not knowing how that tool was helping me to leverage their learning, but that's exactly what I was doing.
Yeah.
And so I remember one day sitting down with one of the little boys in the class. I'm a Black child, and we were reading A Letter to Amy, and by Ezra Jack Keats. And first of all, like, we know Ezra Jack Keats, his work is prominent in the community, especially as him being one of the first authors to really bring in the presence of Black boys in early childhood literature. And so opening this book and we're reading through it, and the child is making different comments like, oh, I didn't know that boys could be friends with girls. And I'm like, yeah, boys can definitely be friends with girls. You can be friends with anybody. And then as we got to the end of the book, he's still asking questions. He's like, that boy looks like me. And I was like, you're right. And I said, well, tell me more about it. Like, what do you see in the book? He was like, well, that's my skin looks like that. My hair looks like that. I have a mommy and daddy too. But that moment right there was powerful for me because it was the first time me ever hearing a Black child saying that's me in a book.
Yeah.
But stepping beyond that, I had to ask myself, Quintin, when was the last time or the first time you saw yourself in a book? And I could not answer that question. I could not answer that question. And that was the start of it all. When I realized that a question as simple as when was the first time you saw yourself in a book, and not being able to answer it fueled me to say, well, why is this? And so I remember reaching out and calling my mom, and I'm like, well, what books did we read growing up? And she's giving all these titles. I'm like, but none of these books have Black boys in them. And I was like, well, why is that? And she's like, well, it was hard finding them. You know, it was just hard finding books with Black and brown children in them, especially Black boys. And from that point, I started doing like my own research, and I started asking questions to some of the teachers in the school. And I was like, well, why is this? And I would look on their bookshelves. I'm like, well, why are mostly the books featured, white children? We're are the children of color. And that was the start of it. And so that next Monday, I went to the admissions office and I went to my little advisor and I said, I want to change my major. And she said, to what? And I said, to education. She's like, are you sure about that? I'm like, I'm totally sure about it.
Yeah. Like, when you know, you know.
Exactly. And she asked me, she said, well, what level? Like high school, middle school, early childhood? And I'm like, well, I'm working in like this pre-K, preschool space, and maybe early childhood. And she said, well, there's this new program called the Birth Through 5 program. And it specifically teaches you how to support kids between infancy to age 5. I said, what? I said, learn how to change diapers? And she was like, no, that's not it. I was like, I'm not going to school to learn how to change diapers. She's like, it's more than that. So I remember that was literally my thought. I was like, this is not, my parents are not going to like this.
Yeah.
Changing diapers, this is not going to be a good conversation.
Yeah.
But I took the first class, and it happened to be a curriculum in Birth Through 5 course. And I was just learning about different parts of curriculum, how the standards align to the objectives, how the objectives align to the lesson plans, how that was applying to like the assessment. So I'm just learning all these different things, but I still had that question of like, what about the diversity in children's books? And so one of the biggest things, this whole idea of me being in this space of diversity in children's literature didn't really start until I got into the PhD program at Georgia State. And I was in the same space, like trying to figure out what I wanted to do in this early childhood and Birth Through 5 space. And I know I had a passion for books, but how to bring that into research was the trick.
Yeah.
And so I was working with a professor, and he asked me to pick up 2 different books. One called Windows by Julie Denham, and another called Crown, an Ode to the Fresh Cut. And I remember going through those books, and that was the first moment that I remember seeing myself in a book and saying like, that's me. Like Crown, the Ode to the Fresh Cut, I was like, I went to the barbershop, and those were the conversations. Like the hoodie he has on, like I have a hoodie like that. The people in the background, they look like my community, my friends. It was like the language that was in the books being used. I mean, I was like, this is the way I speak. And so ultimately down the line, it got into me getting to research and seeing that there was this huge disproportion of books being published featuring children of color. And that right there was the fuel I needed to do the work that I needed to do. I said that not only do we need to look at the representation of Black and brown boys and children and children's literature, but also the stories that these books are telling as well.
Sure.
We've seen over the years that the number of children of color in books has increased. But if you ask the question of deeper, it's like, well, what is being depicted?
Yes.
It gets a little more complex.
Absolutely. Quintin, before we move forward with the second or the consequent part of your journey, how old were you when you read that book, Windows?
Oh my goodness. I was, so
if you don't mind me asking, sorry.
No, you're fine. No, you're fine. I want to say I was 26, 27.
Wow.
And I don't know, let's just say 27 years. I had never recalled a moment where I saw myself in a book besides that one moment I read it in the classroom.
So my next question to that now relates to your past. You have this innate love for books. When you were a child, in your primary years, your secondary years, what were your thoughts around literature, around the language you were consuming? That, yeah.
You know what? I'll be honest. When I remember growing up and reading a lot of information books. Okay. I remember I just remember growing up and books being only used to teach information and not to make emotional connections or to make connections to home and culture. I remember just books being used to like teach you a certain topic, objective, and things of that sort. And so most of my memories around books were, you can get them to learn information, but I didn't start thinking about books can help you learn culture and about other cultures until I got into my 20s. And so I just remember at times like, I mean, I use the African American English. That's the language I speak. You know, I use AE, and so words like ain't and words like little or lil that I used to use and write. I remember my teacher saying it's not proper English, and I'm like, well, that's how I talk. That's how my mom talks, my dad talks, my brothers talk. Like, what? So I began to question, like, and learn that I had to code switch and that my language was not appropriate or status quo for certain spaces, especially in a school setting. And so that also was the fuel too, to get me to where I needed to be today.
And I suppose the speech and language pathologist in America, like Julie Washington, she shines a lot of light on that sort of, it's a dialect, and English has quite a few dialects, and one way is not
it's the only way. So I love Julie Washington. Like, I've taken several classes with her, and she is brilliant. Brilliant. And we still keep in contact to this day. But I remember I just remember her specifically, her and Dr. Goli Muhammad, and just hearing how they would tell me, like, you have to love your language. Like, when you have to fall so in love with it, that no one can tell you how to use it. No one can tell you how to write it, how to speak it. This is your language. Your language has power. And don't let anyone tell you that your language does not have power. And that's for every single child, whether they speak French, English, or AAE. You know, your language has power.
Yes.
And you have to make sure that no one, even the systems that are in place, unfortunately, don't make you feel like your language is not important and powerful.
Yes. Oh my goodness. And do you know what, Quintin, that resonates so deeply with me. So I was born and raised in Kenya. And one of the things growing up was you have to know English. So English is your ticket out, or English is your ticket to whatever you would like to do. And so that created an identity crisis, like from such a young age. And it created an obsession with English, which is an obsession with the language. That's good. Like, it helps you. But then it came at a cost of the other languages. And why not? And at the age of 27 or 28 is when I started, what's going on? What is this? Why am I not appreciating other languages as I would appreciate English? Because and it sort of it really did impact on interactions with others. And oh yeah, I don't think I fully understood the magnitude of that yet.
Exactly. And I think that oftentimes as teachers, we have to think about the systems that we impose on students. I mean, I remember as a pre-K teacher, I worked in an inclusive classroom. And so I remember one of the standards is that children should be able to write their name, right? That's one of the common things, write their first name. But what about the children who don't have the strength to hold a pencil?
Yes.
What about the children who don't have or who have different types of abilities who the pencil is a trigger for them?
Yeah.
You know, so when a standard says a child should be able to write their name, if they write it on paper, do they meet the standard? Yeah. If they write it in the sand with a stick, do they still meet the standard? If they write it with their finger on in paint, do they still meet the standard? And so I had to really ask myself deeply, how can you make your instruction equitable in this classroom so that way all children can access what they need to and achieve the goals? So I remember I did like this deep internalization, like deep reflection. I was like, I'm oppressing children. Like I'm sitting here saying, like, if you don't write it on a paper, then it's wrong. And in actuality, it was like the standard was just write your name. It didn't say paint, marker, chalk, sand, bubble gum. I mean, anything like.
Exactly.
So it just makes me think about how we privilege the norm and how we support the norm. And unintentionally do it unconsciously. And so we got to do that deep interrogation to make sure we're not doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. Gosh, you've articulated that so well. My goodness. But then, okay, so going back to your view, and the last thing you said before I sort of had a tangent was what is being depicted in these books?
Wow.
Was the last. Tell us more about from there.
Yeah, so I'll talk about Crown and Window, since those are the references I've used. So I remember going through my dissertation process and looking at these two books, and Windows particular. So a beautiful book. But there's also a Black boy with his hoodie on, walking down the street in the evening time through his neighborhood. That made me think Trayvon Martin. That made me think Ahmaud Arbery. So this idea that's being perpetuated is that brown boys have the ability to walk home or walk through their neighborhood and come back home, when reality actually says there's a possibility they may not. And so when you do that deep thinking, it's like, wow, like, okay, that's one perpetuation. There's also no father figure represented in that book. What is the narrative surrounding Black fathers in the household and in the media? What is the stereotype? Does this book perpetuate that stereotype? It can be seen as it does.
Yeah.
You know? And also when you think about the idea of colorblindness, I say the character is Black because of his melanated skin.
Yeah.
But nowhere in the book is the character's race or ethnicity revealed. So when you think about this idea of colorblindness being a method of racism, is the lack of identification of the character's race considered colorblindness? Because it could be.
Yeah.
And that colorblindness then can translate into racism.
Yeah.
And that's so when you look at it through that lens.
Sorry, Quintin.
Are you fine?
Oh my goodness. Wow.
So when you look at it through that lens, it's just like, wow, it's powerful. But then you look at Crown, and also with the same idea with Windows is that if you look at the authors and illustrators, they appear to be white women.
Yes.
And white women writing stories about Black boys. What does that mean? And how does that narrative connect to the actual culture? Are they cultural insiders? What happens if they're not cultural insiders? How does that message come out, you know? And then even thinking about Crown's a beautiful book written by two Black men. The words Black are used throughout the book. It is acknowledged. But when you think about boys who might be part of the LGBTQ community, what does that perpetuate? There are scenes in the book where the girls are saying like, "Oh, girl, she's so fine," and what does that do for Black girls? What does that mean for Black girls?
Yeah.
And then the idea that there's this just one hetero type of love, being perpetuated. So for boys or girls who may not have that same feeling emotion, how does that book make them feel?
Yeah.
And even thinking about ability, in both of the books, the kids are able. They're walking, they're smiling, they're thriving.
Yeah.
So for Black and brown kids who don't have those abilities, what does that mean for them? And so the idea is that, not that these books are horrible, because they're not horrible books, but the idea is that when you read these books, what other narratives can you bring in to show a holistic story? And that's the question I always ask people, is that you can have an amazing book and you can have a bad book, but what other story are you sharing? And I always go back to Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's ideas, like the danger of a single story is not that
Yes.
it's untrue, it's incomplete. It's incomplete. So how are you completing the story?
Yes. Okay. So my next question, or rather it's an extension to this question. One of my friends and I have co-authored a children's book.
Yes.
Okay. So it's not yet published or anything, but say we want to be future authors. As writers, what should we take into consideration when we are thinking, or how do we incorporate inclusion in a part of our plan and part of the draft?
Yep. So my brand goes to two different spaces. It goes to a culture responsive pedagogy or culture relevant pedagogy, but also intersectionality. So when you think about CRP, it's kind of broken up into these three main ideas, where it's cultural competence, academic success, and social political consciousness, or that critical consciousness piece.
Yeah.
And so when I think about authors and illustrators, I always say, when you write this book or when you create this book, how's it supporting the academic success of the students? That's number one, right? It can be number one. It's not always number one, but it can be number one.
Yeah.
What words are you using? The vocabulary. What tiers of vocabulary are you using?
Yeah.
What types of language are you using? What topics or ideas or themes will this book help contribute to knowledge of, right?
Yes.
That's that academic success. That critical consciousness is then that step forward where it's like, okay, I noticed that in this book that, let's say, the Black character never speaks, because in Windows, the character never speaks at all.
Yeah.
And then you ask that question of, well, why doesn't he speak?
Yes. And
then you say, well, are kids who are Black and brown, do they ever get the chance to speak? And then you say, why? Yeah. So now I'm thinking about power. I'm thinking about equity. I'm thinking about inclusion. I'm thinking about oppression. I'm thinking about privilege. And those why questions, you have to dig deep. Yeah. It's one thing to say, what is the diversity on this bookshelf? But it's another question to say, like, now that we know the diversity, what are these books saying and perpetuating? That's the question we have to ask. And that last idea is that social political consciousness, which is where, how does your book relate to the current world? And what does your book do to help students learn about the political environment? For example, Windows is a great book to talk about Trayvon Martin. It's a great book to bring up Ahmaud Arbery. It's the great book to talk about there are opportunities and times where Black boys can walk down the street and come back home. There are some times where they don't come back home. Yeah. And then you ask, why is that? And then you can go into oppression. You can go into racism. Yes. What is racism and what is race? And so you grounded in those ideas, but the biggest piece is that intersectionality piece, because it's one thing to say, oh, just a Black child, but if it was a Black girl walking down that street, what could have happened?
Yes.
If it was a Black girl in a wheelchair, what would that have looked like? If it was a character who was a genderqueer, what would that have looked like? And so you have to think about the intersection of these identities and just ask yourself those questions, like, okay, now what if? What if? What if? And if this, then what happens? And so I always want to say, like, to writers and illustrators to think about that, but also just think about the impact that this book can have. going to uplift?
Yeah.
Is it just going to teach a story, or is it possibly going to be damaging? You
Yeah,
know?
that's right. And Quintin, as you're saying that, it really does come down to personal and that real deep self-reflection to go, what is your bias? Where are you coming from in order to ask such deep questions?
Yeah.
Like, correct me if I'm wrong. But
Mhm.
yeah, and sometimes it's just surface level. You don't even realize what's happening that is so deeply rooted. And my next question, or to myself, would be, well, how do I find this out? And what's, what am I avoiding because I'm avoiding for avoidance sake, or I'm avoiding because it's uncomfortable, or I'm avoiding because it really doesn't sit well with me. Like the different, yeah.
Yep. It's just, it's a very, I would say this, the first of all, the world of publishing is very interesting, because you can write a beautiful book that does the work it needs to, and the publisher was to say no.
Yes.
And I think that's oftentimes a fact that is often missed too, is that there are amazing artists of color out here, amazing illustrators of color out here. But when it gets time to the point where they need to publish, it's up to the publisher to say, am I going to have this book in my part of my collection, or am I not? And that's where it kind of goes back into that equity piece, where I have an article that's called The Politics of Children's Literature. I kind of did a review on this book, but I talk about all this stuff, like how even like books are now being privileged to like blockbusters. Like, books are now going from books to media, and books that are in media and movies are now converted into books. Like, I mean, think about Frozen. Oh my goodness, Frozen was a huge movie, and there's books all about it, and then I think the book Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs. It was a book, and then it became films.
Correct.
So it's one of those things where it's kind of like you have to play the game, and I hate saying that, but it's the truth.
Yeah.
Like, you have to play this game, because I aspire to write a book one day, but I also think about my positionality writing this book, and what stories do I want to write and convey, and things of that sort. So
yeah, absolutely. Okay, so again, I tend to digress. Oh my goodness. Let's go back to where were we? What's being depicted? Okay, what came next in your journey?
So after that realization, like I said, I think what really the next big chapter was the PhD program for me, where I had the opportunity and chance to do that deep digging. And from that work, I was able to get an amazing collaboration with student achievement partners. And they realized that I had this dream of ensuring that, I'll step back. I'll digress too. I realized that as a teacher, I didn't have the resources to make these types of thought processes. And I remember in the PhD program, I love tools. I love strategies. Like, I remember as a teacher, I was like, oh, I know that strategy. And I could remember it. If it had a nice little jingle to it, I was like, boom, I got it. I know what this strategy is. I know the terms. I know how to use it. And so I wanted to think about a tool or a strategy that could be used to kind of help teachers process the thing. I mean, because this is deep thinking. This is not something that you can just one layer and we're done. This is multiple layers over and over and over again. And you have to do that personal digging first. Like you said, you got to do that internal bias and that internal reflection and say, why am I choosing this book and why am I not choosing this book? But the bigger question is, the book that I don't choose, why do I not want to use the book? Why do I not want to have the conversation? And I hear a lot of teachers say, like, the topic of race is very sensitive. I don't want to talk about race. Well, let's step back and talk about your idea. Exactly. Why? What in your experiences have impacted your fear about talking about race in the classroom? Because once we knock that out and figure that out, then these conversations to help students unpack race and racism, you'll be equipped and ready to do those conversations. And so with that, I said, I want to make a tool that kind of helps teachers do this work, and was able to get a beautiful partnership with Student Achievement Partners. And they were pretty much like, we love this dream and vision. This is something that we support as well. And we want to bring this to light. And that's exactly what
Yes.
happened.
Oh, from a seed to a tree. That is fabulous. Okay, tell us, please, let's take a deep dive into this tool that you've created, because I know I've downloaded it, I have read it, and I was like, oh my goodness, we can be using it. And I will, as soon as schools go back, I'm going to be using it with my
Yay!
students. And I'm going to be, yeah, because I know that you are after feedback, and I will be sending you some feedback.
Yes,
But
yes.
I just see the credit in it, the honor in it, and how much we can draw. And yes, it's, you have created it in America, but I
Yep.
can see a transfer into Australia, and I can also see a transfer into Kenya. So it's more a global tool. Yeah.
And that is honestly, I'm so honored to hear that, because that was the goal. I wanted any teacher, no matter where they were in their journey, their location, the grade level they taught, to be able to take this tool and say, okay, I'm going to be very intentional about how I select books in the classroom and how I use them. And so kind of connecting back to kind of where this tool kind of came from and the different components, we all know that, like we just talked about, the first thing to do in this journey of equity is to start with yourself. And so one of the first components is to know yourself and know your students. And so there's a group of questions that pretty much help you to think about, how do you show up in the classroom? How do your students show up in the classroom? And so you think about, what identities do I as a teacher bring into this classroom? And how do those identities impact the way I support students and instruct? And more importantly, how I pick books in the classroom.
Yes.
And the next idea is to know yourself, but also know your students. And so how are you collecting information on your students? Are you assuming based on what you see? Or are you actually having those conversations and using those cultural surveys or those one-on-one moments with students and families to really know them?
Yes.
And then once you know them, truly know them, then you can kind of reflect and get guidance on, like, okay, now how do I begin to use these texts? So I know myself, I know my students, and now it's time for me to start playing with the book. And so I always say, this is so funny. Like I always tell teachers, I'm like, you can't just pick up a book that you got from the library and just pick it up and read it. Like you need to take the time to go through it yourself, right? Like
absolutely. Yes.
And so that's that next step, is read and reflect, where you as the teacher or the reader of the book picks it up and you ask those questions. Who's represented in this book? Who's not represented in this book? What feelings or emotions did I get from reading this book? How can this book be used in my classroom? How can this book be paired and coupled with other stories to provide a full holistic story? And so once you, like I said, know yourself, know your students, you pick up that book and do that initial reading, you then get into the deep digging. This is my favorite part of the tool, which is the analysis and reflection piece. And so what we did was we broke it up surrounding, of course, culturally relevant pedagogy by Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings. And so what we did was we coupled her tenets of CRP, which are academic success, cultural competence, and critical consciousness, and paired those with the considerations for qualitative text complexity. So we're looking at meaning and purpose, we're looking at structure, we're looking at knowledge, we're looking at language. And we're then basically bringing those all together. And we're asking these powerful questions, like when you think about meaning and purpose, and you think about critical consciousness, you're like, whose perspective is being presumed or centered in this text? Whose voices are being present? Does this text help our students become change agents? Or does it just help them to say, oh, okay, I learned something? Where's that motivation there, right? And then when you think about the structure, my favorite piece is the graphics and illustrations. Like, do the graphics and illustrations, do they have the potential to expand students' thinking? And if it does, is expanded in a way that's oppressive, or is it expanded in a way that's non-oppressive? And then you ask that question, like, well, I'm not really sure about that. There's questions that, as a teacher, I didn't even ask. Or even saying, like, what is the dominant culture represented in the book? You know, or asking the questions often like, is the main character white and all the kids in the background black?
Yeah.
You know, and what does that look like? You know, so how is that book structured?
Mm.
And so you then kind of go into that knowledge piece, which is just like, you know, what is this book? What are the topics that it conveys? What are the ideas?
Yes.
Um, what knowledge do students need before reading this book?
Yep.
You know, how do you scaffold this for a child who may have never heard about a topic like racism?
Yes.
How do you help them to learn about that topic before even engaging in this book?
Yeah.
And then the last piece, which is the language piece. And it's thinking about the language in the book, like is it explicit? Is it figurative? And even thinking about the language used, like, is it all English? Languages? Is there Braille being used?
Yes.
You know, and so the part of this tool which is most important is that this is the part that might take the longest to go through, but it's the powerful piece.
Yeah.
Because the thing is that if you pick up this, let's say if your principal or school leader comes in and is like, well, why did you pick this book? You have this tool that you have now gone through, and you can say and justify, I'm using this because of this. And I'm going to use this to talk about this because of this. And so it helps to provide teacher with the language to really think about why and how to use this book.
Yes.
And once you're gonna get past that analysis piece, the next big piece is pretty much the planning piece. It's like, all right, here's where the fun begins. Like, I got all these ideas. I know what the book represents. I'm playing with it. I'm seeing the different aspects of it. Let's plan now. And so taking those same exact questions and really thinking about how can I plan to use this book? What open-ended questions will spark critical thinking? What key terms should be pushed in and pulled out to really help students grasp this concept? What about this book can be extended, you know, and applied to real life settings? And so you do that planning piece. And so the idea is that as you navigate through this tour from top to bottom, from beginning to end, not only do you develop a different relationship with the book, but you also develop a different understanding of how the book can be used with other books.
Yes.
And it's how and with. And I always push that. How can I use this with other books? I think sometimes it may be assumed that you go through this book and it's like, oh, it's perfect, it's great. And you just use this book over and over and over again. But like we said, there is a danger of a single story.
Yes.
There is a true danger of it. And so we want to make sure that you think about why use this book and what else it can be paired with.
Yes.
And the idea is that this is just a tool that can just really help teachers to have those conversations. I can see this being used in like a small group planning session with different teachers, like a different theme or unit comes up, you know, and you have all these amazing books and like, well, I want to read this book and I'll read this book. And there may be different opinions about the books. And one way to kind of navigate that conversation around the opinions of the book is through this tool.
Absolutely. And Quintin, as you're talking about the different layers of this particular toolkit, I was thinking about Scarborough's reading rope and the language elements component of that reading rope. And there is absolute background knowledge, vocabulary, the language structures, but within it, the sentence structures and just how, language is used. And that was a beautiful sort of alignment and so for anyone that is thinking, you know, how are we going to use it? Yes, it is deeply aligned with Scarborough's reading rope and the language comprehension component of it.
Yep, exactly. And I love hearing that because, you know, I think sometimes as scholars, like especially like in the academic space, as I want to put quotes around it, the academic space, you want to bring all these different theoretical ideas and frameworks in. But at the end of the day, you have to ask yourself, they're all working towards the same goal, right? To ensure that children have the language and literacy skills to thrive and be successful.
Yes.
And whether that's through a rope or through 3 tenets or through different pillars, or I think we have to think about one, the academic success, which is that comprehension, that vocabulary, the use of questions, the use of language, but taking a step beyond that and saying, now let's ask these hard critical questions.
Yes.
And then how can you take that learning and apply it to society? in a way that benefits everyone around you.
Yeah. And the other thing I also would love to explore with you, Quintin, is that we, as adults, we want to protect children and we want to protect them from these very difficult topics and sort of to almost maintain their innocence and have them have their childhood. But one thing is they know a lot more than we give them credit for. They observe a lot more. And thinking about what they're exposed to in the current world today is, gosh, I think when I was growing up, I may have had a tunnel vision. I was like, oh my goodness, very simple. But to go and to even think about children, but even with that tunnel vision, I was forever observing, forever thinking about things like, who are the people I'm near in whatever space? How are they being treated? The minute I had language, they were internal questions. I may not have articulated them verbally, and I may not have asked those huge questions, but they were part of the identity crisis that started maybe even at 3 years of age. I don't know. It's for as long as I've known myself, I've known that I've done certain things. Let's talk a little bit about, yes, they are hard topics. Yes, they'll evoke emotions and, even to the point of guilt. But how do we use that constructively and, for critical consciousness?
So I Dr. Bettina Love, she has a quote in a book, and her We Want to Do More to Survive, but it's along the lines of that conversations that unpack race and racism are essential to the lives of all dark children. And what she means is that if you truly want to change the world, especially coming down to racial equity, these conversations have to happen, right?
Yeah.
What does it look like for a person who has never had this experience, goes to a college space, and then just starts trying to unpack race, compared to a person or a student who has been having these conversations preschool? It's been part of their life since elementary. They've used it in middle school. They have the language in high school. They know the questions to ask, and they get to college. How does that position them now? And so I think oftentimes we have to ask ourselves, what are we hiding from our students? What are we fearful about them knowing? Are we fearful that if we teach them these concepts, they'll continue to perpetuate them? Or is it the fear that if we teach these concepts, this oppression will stop, which then gives power and shifts power in different directions? And so I think that it all comes back to power. And I always say students, especially young children, have the power to learn these topics. The first thing a child sees is skin color and difference. I was in preschool and pre-K for years. And the first topics and conversations, well, you look different than me. Your hair's different than mine. Your skin's different than mine. They see it. Help them name it. Yes, your skin is different. You are of a different race than your friend. And guess what that means? You all have different cultures. And they're like, what is culture? It's your language. It's the music. It's your home. It's your structure. And they're like, wow. And these are all the things that we are already doing in our early years. We're teaching them all about me. That is a perfect place to learn about you and your peers and the differences and similarities to them. So we have to get beyond the fear that our kids can't have these conversations, because they can. And they are having them, whether you're present or not, whether you like it or not. And the idea is that, are you going to be that person that's going to help them have this conversation in a way they can be change agents in society? Or are you going to blind them and help them to say, like, oh, this is just the way life is. This is just how it is. Because that's the problem. Teach them early. They see it, they feel it, they know it. It's a part of them. It is not going away.
And then I have this other sort of question. When we do teach them early, say as adults, the statement, it is the way it is, as opposed to let's take a deep dive. So when we're taking a deep dive, we have to be ready for what that brings up for us as well. What emotions it evokes, and it might even be triggers we are not consciously aware of.
Mm-hmm.
How do we be okay with that and at the same time deliver a decent message, or at least a good conversation, have a good conversation with the teacher or children?
One of the most powerful things any teacher can do is be vulnerable and be transparent.
Yeah.
It is okay to say, I don't know. Because let me tell you something. When I was teaching, Trayvon Martin was killed. And I had students, pre-K kids, come up to my classroom saying, I hate cops. My mom and daddy told me don't like the cops. They literally we don't like the cops. Not in our house. We don't like cops. They kill people. And as a teacher, you want to say, no, that's not all people are like that. You know, that's not the experience. But as a Black man, I felt them. Yeah. I am scared to leave this school too by myself, because I could probably not come back tomorrow to teach this classroom. And if something was to happen to me, I want my students to know that, you know what, Mr. Quintin might have been killed by the police, and I know what that was. That's racism. That's oppression. I want them to be able to have the words to name it. Yes. Because if they can't name it, they can't really figure it out. So help them to process and name things. Give them the words so they can ask you the questions. If they don't have the words, they can't ask you the questions.
Yes.
You see kids depressed, like, why? Like, why? And they're like, that's them trying to get the words.
That's exactly right. The big ideas are there, but it needs to be refined and it needs to be made more specific in order for specific questions to be answered.
Exactly.
Oh my goodness.
They have to have the words, and the only way to get the words is through conversations. Yeah. And so the question I ask is that, do you not want them to have the words to have these conversations?
Yeah.
Because that's a problem.
That's a hard question, isn't it? How confronting is it when, exactly, do you not have them? And that might not even be the case, but you wouldn't know it until that question was asked.
And so being vulnerable is it, because I sat with my kids and said, they asked me, why are police killing Black people?
Yeah.
And you know what I said? There's racism in America. And they're like, what's racism?
Yes.
I pulled out my books about groundwork education. I poured out all my different kids' books about just violence and oppression from different communities, and gender oppression, and sexual orientation oppression, religious oppression. I mean, like, we're pulling out books like The Proudest Blue and talk about hijabs and things of that sort. And it's like, kids are like, well, I didn't even know this existed. Yeah. Like, people like, and they would ask you, wait, they don't like them because of their color or because of their religion? And they say, why? And then you explain it, well, this has been the history. This is what's been provided in society. Here's what the history shows us. And then you say, it doesn't have to be this way. Yes. And it starts with you. Yeah. It starts with you. Empower them. Empower them. I told every child in my classroom, I don't care if you leave out of here and not know how to speak your name. If you can empower yourself. Yes. If you're empowered to have these conversations, then my job is done.
Yeah. And we as adults are models for that empowerment, right? In order to tell them that, we need to be able to believe it and do it ourselves. Exactly. And show it. And it will show for itself. We're not showcasing it, but that belief and doing.
Exactly. Like, I always say kids have to thrive. We all want to thrive.
Absolutely.
And
just part of humans.
Exactly.
Humans want to, they want to and they need to, right?
We have to. It's a part of being growing and old and being happy. You got to thrive.
Exactly. Oh my goodness. And now are you okay for time, Quintin? Beautiful. So my next question is, okay, initially at the start of the conversation, you talked about diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-racism. That in relation to you growing up. Why are those 4 terms so deeply rooted to your being?
Because they were rooted in everything that I did as a family. My grandparents were the segregated schools. My parents were children that were in the military, and they witnessed segregation, desegregation, post and pre. And I mean, they my mom experienced colorism because of her fair skin. It was always at the forefront. And I went to an all black, predominantly black high school.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw it in the way that my friends who were predominantly white schools, different resources. Why is your baseball field nicer than ours? And why do your teachers having resources and ours don't? And so it was constantly around us to the point where you can't avoid it.
Yes.
Like there's no way to not have the conversation. I think that oftentimes it's easy to avoid the conversation, but I came from a family where we're going to have this conversation because I want you to be prepared. I think there's this thing called the talk in the Black community where, you know, you have that talk when your kids are growing up and saying, you know, racism's real.
Yeah.
And I want you to come home at night. So I have to have this conversation with you. Can you imagine a parent saying, I need to talk to you about this? Because if you don't notice, you might not come home tonight.
Oof.
That right there is why those words are close to my heart.
Yeah.
It's something that my family acknowledged, my ancestors acknowledged, my community acknowledged.
Yeah.
And it's a way of survival. And even though you should be living this life of survival, like you should be out here thriving and being happy and being free and being who you want to be, but you also have to know the nature of the beast in reality as well.
Yes. Do you remember that first conversation, Quintin, when your parents sat down? Take us through what that was like, what it brought out for you, and maybe even for them, if you, you
know what, to be honest with you, I don't remember the first conversation because it was so many of them. But one that stands out in particular is I remember one night I was actually leaving a restaurant with some friends of mine, and I was driving home. My home was maybe 5 minutes from the restaurant. And I remember driving and being pulled over, and I had a moment where I asked myself, I said, well, what did you do? Did you run a light? Did you skip the stop sign? And I realized I didn't. Something in that moment was just like, call your mom. Like, I called my mom and I was just like, hey, I just got pulled over. She's like, okay. And she didn't even ask, what did you do? She said, put your hands on the wheel. Get the phone on. Turn the music down. Be respectful. I need you to come home. And I was pulled over, and the cop asked me for my license, registration, blah, blah, blah. And the first question he asked is this your car? I said, yes, this is my car. It has to be, it's a luxury vehicle, but this is my car. I've worked my behind off for this car. So I responded, yes, this is my car. Okay, we're going to go check. There was a vehicle that was stolen by a Black man in the inner area with the same kind of vehicle. And I'm like, okay, perfect. All right. Come back. He's like, all right, car register, you good to go. Your tail light, not your tail light, but your license plate is dark. So I'm gonna give you a ticket for your dark tail light. I mean, a dark license plate. And I'm like,
oh, wow.
Well, what just happened? Like, so I left that scene saying, well, if I'd been in a different kind of car, would I even have gotten pulled over and gotten this ticket? And is this ticket even valid? Like, what does that dark license plate mean? Like, I mean, I didn't even know what that means. Like,
Oh my goodness.
I remember that conversation going home, and my mom just telling me, like, I'm glad you're home. I'm glad you're safe. This probably won't be the last time this happens, though. And what do you do with that? And that's why I do this work. That's exactly why I do this work.
Absolutely. Wow. The magnitude of that. And just, thinking about, and I suppose this is one of the issues, is when you haven't experienced it firsthand, or you've experienced it in a different context, in that firsthand, it's really difficult to empathize with. You can't empathize with someone. You can't empathize how deeply it can affect someone.
Exactly.
And that's why those conversations are quite, they're critical to have, they're powerful to have, but there is a certain manner in which, and again, bringing it back to your point, being vulnerable, but also being vulnerable in that space of, okay, I need to know more about this. I need to do a little bit of a deep dive into, for instance, oppressive structures I may not understand, but they exist. And if that's something that needs to be taught, then I need to start to do my research and understanding it better.
Exactly.
And it doesn't, it's not all about getting it from books, getting it from written material. It's conversations being had, getting people to talk about their personal experiences and having that back and forth, serve and return, question and answer. What was it like? But from a point of curiosity, a genuine curiosity.
And kids are naturally curious.
Yes,
Ask questions. They always do. I love working in that space because they ask questions.
Absolutely. And do you know what, Quintin? So are adults. Adults are just tainted by all of these PC terminology and there is the fear of, if I do ask this question, what is it going to come across as? And rather than it being misconstrued, it's better not asked. And that is a danger in itself.
Exactly. It's a huge danger right there in itself. Exactly. You're exactly right.
No, but thank you so much. Oh my goodness, for sharing this amazing work that you do. And I will have a link to your student toolkit, which I'll get you to send it to me. I'm pretty sure I have it saved, but yes. Is there anything, Quintin, that I haven't asked you that you have wanted to share, or something, that we haven't covered?
I think we touched on a lot of things. I think if I had to have a sticky message to like leave and stamp this with, it would be that, it's stories do matter, right? And we know that, but what stories are being told and how they're being told and from whose perspective should also be considered too. There are multiple stories out there. But who's telling the story?
Yes. Absolutely. And it goes down to grassroots level, community. Talk to the people that have experienced it firsthand. And while it may be difficult to consume that information, our world is dynamic. Our world is constantly changing. It does not have to be the way it used to be.
Exactly. And it will always evolve and continue to evolve. And as people, as we evolve too, we have to be able to say, like, this was wrong.
Yes.
This was wrong, and we need to fix it.
That's right. And it's not to say that these mistakes are not going to be made in the future. Heck yes, that's how we learn. That's how we grow. That's mistakes are to be made so that we can learn from it. But it's to, acknowledging and accepting it, really.
And living and breathing it. That's literally it. That's literally it. You're right.
No, that is so beautiful. And key takeaways. Actually, were those your key takeaways? What stories are being told? Who are they being told by?
Yep. That's it.
What's
and I just be open to stories.
Yes.
I think if I had to say, like, if like I said, if I had that sticky message, that's what it will be. But also, if in the perfect world, I would love for every single book that a child picks up to have gone through a reflective process.
Yes.
And I want the books to be asked the questions. Ask the book, who's represented, who's not represented. How does power operate in this book? And what will this book do to students who are here in this representing this book and who are not representing this book? And so you got to go deeper. It's you got to go beyond representation. We got to go beyond that. We have to. And then until we do that, we're going to keep perpetuating the same exact ideas.
Absolutely. No, that is brilliant. And where do people find you for all this work that you're doing? Tell us more about your business. So what is it?
So you can find me, my information through my website at drquintinbostic.com. And you can see a list of my publications, descriptions of my work, upcoming work. I also do professional development trainings and speeches and small group PLC supports. surrounding diversity in the classroom, curriculum and instruction.
Mm.
And so if anybody ever has the want to learn more about diversity in children's literature, or just how to embed, as I call it, JEDI, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, anti-racism in the
Yes.
classroom, you can definitely reach out to me through my website. And so I'm open to having these conversations. It's a passion of mine. And so
Yes.
this is what makes me happy and thrive. So
Beautiful. That is amazing. Thank you so much, Quintin.
thank
And I'll
you.
have all of your links in the notes. And yes, but for everybody that is going to engage with this conversation, please share it. We need more of these conversations to be taking place, and in the most authentic manner possible. Please share it. We don't know who it's going to connect with. And thank you to everyone that will engage. And thank you so much, Quintin.
Thank you for having
Yeah.
me. I appreciate you so much.
No worries.